Although we have tried to make this production as accurate as possible, it must be appreciated that iaido is a living art and is subject to change. In addition, it is recommended that iaido is learnt from an authorized instructor. This production is designed only to aid the learning process. The Muso Jikiden Eishinru Omoriru Training Reference. The intention of this production is to provide a beginner's training aid that will help you develop your iai. By serving as a reference, it will allow you to train outside normal training hours. This production is aimed at students between the grades of 7th Q and 1st Dan. This allows us to show the basics and get you into good habits from the beginning. Oe Masamichi was the last undisputed headmaster and founder of Muso Jikiden Eishinru iaido. This is the style of swordsmanship demonstrated in this production. Oe Sensei was born in 1852 and he died in 1927. During his life he became known as an expert swordsman and fought in the last of Japan's great sword battles, the Clam Gate War. In later life, he formulated and taught the 43 forms which currently make up the ryu. The school is split into 3 main levels of kata: Omori-ryu, Eishin-ryu, and Oku-iai. Reiho, Kamiza Rei. Reiho. To Rei. Mai. Miggy. Hidari. Ushiro. Yeigaki. Ukinagashi. Kaishaku. Tsukekomi. Tsukikage. Oikaze. Nukiuchi. Reiho. To Rei. Reiho. Kamiza Rei. Reiho is the word used to describe etiquette, and it means the way of the bow or bowing. There are many considerations to the etiquette in and out of the dojo within the EI world. For further information on these considerations, you should consult with your dojo leader or instructor. For this video, we will be looking specifically at the starting and ending bows. The movements look simple and functional, and they are. However, you should remember that every movement has a meaning. Nothing should be forgotten, or performed without thought. The reihos are performed out of respect for the sword, school, and the knowledge that is being passed on. This means that the reihos should be performed whenever you intend to practice. The sword should be held with the left hand, thumb on tsuba, hand at the left hip, cutting edge up. The sagyo should be looped in thirds, with the loose end on the inside of the loop. The sagyo should be held between the left index finger and the second finger. The sword will be at a natural angle, slightly across the body, with end pointing down about 45 degrees. Push the sword out about 6 to 8 inches along the line of the saya, rotating the cutting edge flat and to the left as you do so. Keep the whole movement smooth and keep the sword close to the body. With the palm of the right hand facing upwards, place the sagyo in the gap between the first and second finger of the right hand. Rotate the right hand and grasp the saya just past the left hand. Let the sword rotate naturally as you move the right hand to the rei position at the right thigh. The saya should be pointing almost directly at the floor, not out at 45 degrees. The metsuke is fixed, straight out from the eyes, and should only drop as you start the bow in the final part of the rei. If you drop your metsuke early in the process, you are presenting a weakness that could be utilized if you were facing an opponent. Although there is no opponent in this case, it is best to practice this level of awareness right from the start. On the command to rei, bow from the waist to about 45 degrees. In seiza, the big toes should be touching at most, not crossed. The knees should be about 2 fist widths apart, with the back straight, the head up, and the chin in. Throughout jikiden, seiza is done with the buttocks just touching the heels, or better still, with a slight gap between them. This is achieved with a little tension in the thighs, giving a light feeling to the posture. Keeping metsuke straight, push the sword out 6 to 8 inches along the line of the saya. Take the sagyo between the right index and second finger, the right thumb on the tsuba. Withdraw the sword the remainder of the way with the right hand, the left hand brushing down the saya back to the left hip. Push forward rather than to the right. With the right arm fully extended, rotate the sword out and down until it touches the floor at about 45 degrees to the body. Drop the tsuba to the floor on the left, pulling the sword slightly in towards you to allow the sagyo to clear the saya as it is laid down. Position the sword on the floor parallel to the body, with the center of the sword in line with your center. Lay out the sagyo along the line of the sword away from you, from left to right. This should all be done in a continuous flowing movement with no stop. Do not make a fuss over it. A strong feeling of respect in the rei is much more important than the mechanics. Keeping the eyes straight ahead, drop the left hand to the floor with the fingers pointing to the center of the sword. In a mirrored motion, drop the right hand so that its fingers are also pointing to the center of the sword. Drop the elbows to the ground adjacent to the knees, but close enough to actually touch them. Do not drop your head, as this exposes the nape of your neck. Bow from the waist, allowing your eyes to follow a natural course down. Hold the posture for the count of 3 or 4, that is, long enough to show respect to the sword and for the training to come. Please ensure that you do not allow the hips to rise during the bow. To recover the sword, move the right hand down to take the sagyo loop between the right index and second finger. Again, try to keep the metsuke up during this process, during embu or gradings. Move the right hand up to take hold of the tsuba with the right thumb or index finger. The choice is yours. Start to lift the sword with the sword still touching the floor. When upright, move the sword in the vertical position in front of the knees. It should be about 4 to 6 inches in front of the knees, in line with your center. Brush down the last third of the saya, from below the sagyo to the kojiri, the bottom of the sword. Then, raising the left hand and dropping the right hand, bring the sword to the center of your obi. With the left thumb, make a gap between the fold of your obi closest to your gi and the next fold. Position the kojiri in the center of your obi, where you have made the gap. Push the sword into the obi with the right hand on the tsuba until it is about 3/4 inserted. Then move the left hand to take the tsuba, then the right hand to take the end of the ska, and make the final insertion by applying pressure to the kashira. The center of the tsuba should end up in line with your center. If you have tied your hakama properly, the left hand can stay at the central position. When the insertion is completed, the right hand lets go of the kashira and goes to the top of the right thigh. The left hand goes to the tsuba and goes to the top of the left thigh, and you are sitting in seiza with the sword properly inserted. Then stand with power and reverence, pushing from the lower back up, stepping forward.
The kata performed in Jikiden are made up of principal movements. These movements are as follows: Nukitsuki, Kuritsuki, Chibori, Noto. These 4 movements appear, in one shape or another, in all the kata we practice. Once these 4 movements can be performed competently, the rest should follow fairly quickly. However, perfecting these 4 movements is not so easy. The first of these movements is the Nukitsuke. This is the draw and cut. In a moriru, this form begins from a kneeling position, with tension in the legs and a feeling of power. Your hands move to the sword as your legs come together. Break the seal between the sword and saya with your thumb and begin to draw. You should still be in a kneeling position at this point. When your sword is nearly 1/3 of the way out of the saya, begin to rise towards your opponent. As the sword is about to leave the saya, turn it so that the sword lies on its side and you cut out towards your opponent in a question mark shape, as seen from above. You should use your hips to cut the sword out of your opponent. The second cut, Kuritsuke, is thought of as the finishing cut. It is assumed that the first cut caught the opponent off guard, but did not kill him, and a second cut is needed to strike the killing blow. This cut comes straight after the Nukitsuke, and begins with a furikamuri action as the sword moves around and above the head, ready to cut again. You must be careful to make sure that the arm does not block your sight of the opponent. A proper furikamuri movement will ensure that this does not happen. Your legs should extend, ready for the move forward with the cut. Remember to make a big cut out, like casting a fishing rod. Your front leg should come to rest at a 90-degree angle. The sword comes to rest just below the knee. so make sure you have a firm left wrist so the scut of the sword does not ride upwards. It is now assumed that the final blow has killed the opponent. However, awareness must be maintained. Chiburi means blood shake. This is where you remove the excess blood from your sword. In a mori-ryu, this is an elaborate swing with the sword in an arc, an o-chiburi. In some forms, you perform a yoko chiburi, a side blood shake, or a chinigui, a blood wipe. The standard method, o-chiburi, sees you perform the chiburi after a slight pause once kiritsuke is finished. Move the sword upwards and to the right towards the corner of the room. Then bring the sword in towards your forehead by bending your arm at the elbow as if you are saluting with the sword in your hand. Then, beginning with the squeezing of your little finger, push down on the ska, bringing the sword down in an arc with increasing acceleration. The sword should stop just past your right foot with the tip pointing inwards. Pause for a second, then push your foot back ready for the noto. The choice of foot depends on the form. Another style of blood shake performed is yoko chiburi, which is performed by pushing the whole blade sideways from the center position. The right hand grip is rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise and pushed away from the left hand, forwards and out, allowing the sword to rest horizontally with the tip slightly down. This will be discussed in more detail in a later video. Once you are sure that the opponent is dead and you have removed the blood from your sword, put it away. However, do not let your guard down. You must always assume that there are other opponents waiting to strike, so when you perform the noto, it must be done with a sense of readiness. The noto begins with the left hand, which moves up the seiya. Once you feel the kurigata, you know that the seiya is the right way up. Move it so that it is ready to receive the sword. The next movement should begin with the hips and then the arm, moving the sword round so that it rests on the arm somewhere between shoulder and elbow. The right hand thrusts the sword straight out towards your opponent, but slightly off the center line. Again, this is with a feeling of power, since you are warning off any onlookers that might wish to attack. Draw the sword back into the seiya as you begin to drop. As the sword comes to rest in the seiya, your knee should brush the floor without your weight resting on it. Once the sword is in the seiya, place your thumb on the tsuba, rise to your feet, and check the sword is properly away. Then step back to your spot. These are the 4 basic movements that make up my and the rest of the kata you will practice. I will now go on to a further explanation of each of the forms that you must perform in a mori-ryu. However, the details I have just been through on the basics apply to all the forms you will now see. Two opponents are sat opposite each other. They do not trust each other and are still wearing their swords. Opponents begin to draw their swords at the same time. However, one is slightly faster than the other and manages to cut first. He then chases for a finishing cut, performs the chiburi, and then the noto. Mai is the first and most important of all the forms in our school, since it encompasses the four basics completely. The form begins with you stood on the spot from which you will begin. The first thing you should do is adjust your mindset. The moment you go to kneel down, you have begun the form. A certain awareness and attention should be applied while you are stood breathing. You then sit down as you mean to do the form. A general point which can be applied to all of the forms is one of posture. First, the seated position, seiza. Your back should be straight, your knees should be 2 fist widths apart, with your hands on your knees and fingers closed, pointing slightly inward. Allow your arms to relax by your side, but you may push your chest out. Remember that there should be tension in the legs. You should also note that throughout this form, the demonstrator's back is straight, his head is up, and his knees are bent at a 90-degree angle. When he is stood, his back is straight, his head is up, his knees are bent and they are apart. You should not lean and never drop your head. These are easy habits to get into, and difficult ones to get out of. Remember that the form begins and finishes stood up on your spot. The moment you are on your spot after walking back from the form, you have finished, and not before. This means that even when you are walking back, you should have the same reverence and the awareness that you carried with you throughout the form. First, your hands go to the sword. The left hand moves straight to the saya, moving towards the koiguchi. The right hand moves to the end of the ska, and slowly moves down it towards the tsuba. You must break the seal between the sword and saya with the thumb, and this is done slowly, ready for the draw. While still considering the basics, we are going to build on them in Mai with a few extra points. Pay special attention to the fact that the draw begins before the body begins to rise. You should wait until your sword is nearly a third of the way out before you begin to rise. This prevents you from moving yourself into the opponent's cutting range prematurely, and also promotes a sense of acceleration into the form, Jo-ha-kyu. Jo-ha-kyu means fast, faster, fastest, and it denotes a gradual acceleration from the beginning of the draw until the point of contact with the opponent. You should strive to achieve this throughout all the forms. Look carefully at this close-up of the move from Nukitsuke to Kiritsuke. Remember the Furikamuri action. You must make sure that you do not block your line of sight with your opponent. The movement begins with the wrist, and then the arm moves up to the head ready for the cut. This is very important. Notice that the Kiritsuke is a big cut that goes out and cuts the opponent on the way back. This is how a Japanese sword works. The Kiritsuke should be thrown out in a big arc. Notice how far out the sword is just before it would hit the target. It must be like this, otherwise you won't cut the opponent, you'll chop them. Mai, the first form from the Omori-ryu set. Everything we have covered in the last 5 minutes can be and should be applied to all the forms which follow it. What we will go over in the rest of the forms are just extensions to these basic functions, and any slight changes that might occur. Migi, meaning right, is essentially the same as Mai, with a few small differences. At the beginning of the form, turn to your right, so that the first horizontal cut is to the left. This means that as you draw, you must turn ready to cut your opponent. Let's watch Migi again, and you should take special note of the turn. The demonstrator will do it slowly for you to see, but you will notice an insert in the top right hand corner which is showing the same form from another direction, enabling you to see both sides of the movement. As well as taking note of the turn, look at the cut as well. You should notice that it is a reaching cut. Looking at that turn in a little more detail, instead of the knees coming together, it is the right knee that comes to the left. You will begin to draw as you rise. Once you're up on your knees and toes, all you have to do is raise your left knee. This turns you towards your opponent. When you raise the knee, make sure that the foot stays slightly back, thus giving you the option to move according to where the opponent is, in this case forward. You should also note that the cut has an extension on the right shoulder. This is to make up for the fact that you are knelt up on the left leg and not the right. The cut must be slightly forward to keep a strong posture. The rest of this form is essentially the same as mine. However, you put the left leg back after the chiburi instead of the right. Migi. Hidari, meaning left, is performed in the same way as Mai. However, at the beginning of the form, you turn left 90 degrees, leading your draw and cut to be performed to the right, towards Shomen. Watching Hidari, you will see that there is an insert in the top right hand corner, which shows the same form from another direction once again, allowing you to see both sides of the form. You will notice with this form that the only difference between Hidari and Mai is that you turn to the left at the beginning. The technique for this form is identical to that in Mai. Apply the methods you learned in Mai to Hidari. To recap, in Hidari, your left knee goes to the right knee. You then raise the right knee to face your opponent, placing the foot slightly back so that your knee is less than at a right angle to the floor. The rest of the form is as in Mai, so take this opportunity not just to go through the motions, but also to practice the basics. This goes for all the forms. Hidari.
Ushiro is similar to the last couple of forms, but instead of turning 90 degrees round to meet your opponent, you turn 180 degrees anti-clockwise, so when you begin your form, the opponent is behind you. Once you have turned to meet your opponent, the form carries on the same way as in Migi.
When practicing Ushiro, you should build on the techniques you learnt in Migi and Hidari. The turn isn't any more complicated, you are only turning a little further. Because it is similar to Migi, after the initial turn, there is again an extension with the right shoulder on the Nikitsuke, and your left leg is used when stepping back after the Chiburi. Because you are moving in an anti-clockwise direction when you turn to meet your opponent, the first movement is your right knee to left. You begin to draw and rise, and while rising to your knees, you should kick your right foot out to the side by a few degrees, so that when you are fully up on your knees and toes, the left leg points backwards, and the right leg points off to the side as much as possible. This makes the turn a lot easier. The rest of the form is the same as Migi, so make sure you extend that right shoulder, and remember to practice the basics through these beginning forms. The basics are the most important part of the kata we practice.
Ushiro. In Yaegak, you face a seated opponent that is attempting to cut you. The form begins the same as Mai. However, after the Nikitsuke, you perform a dropping cut down on your opponent, moving with a definite up and down movement. With this action, you step through to make distance. After performing a Yoko Chiburi and Noto, you react to a last dying attack to your right leg from your opponent by blocking. You then drop under your sword, onto your knee, and finish the opponent off with a vertical cut. Perform Ochiburi and Noto, and then step back to your spot and finish.
After assuming the seated position, your first movement should be to look up towards your opponent. Without taking Metsuke from the opponent, perform the Nikitsuke. From here, your opponent has fallen back, but is still stood up, and so you must step through and cut. The cut is big, as you are cutting into his chest. It begins as you drop down, and the cut finishes when your knee touches the ground. Be careful not to drop too much weight onto your knee, it should just be brushing the floor. From here, perform Yoko Chiburi and then Noto. While performing the Noto, begin to move backward, but before you begin to sink, you realise that an attack is coming. The second half of the form is performed slightly quicker than the first, because you are reacting to an unexpected attack from your opponent. The attack comes from the floor and is directed towards your right shin. This means that from the Noto position, you must come up and back with the left foot, drawing forward and bringing the sword down and across your body, with a feeling of snapping into position. Your stance should be forward with your weight on your right leg, giving you a strong posture and making sure the opponent's sword is stopped. From here, push your sword forward and up in a guarding motion, and drop down beneath it. Bring the blade round and finish your opponent with a final cut. This cut stops slightly lower than normal because your opponent is on the floor. Perform Ochiburi and Noto to finish the form.
Yigaki.
Okinagashi is one of the more difficult forms from the Amori-Ryu set, and involves a standing opponent. You see the attack and send the opponent a warning that you are prepared. The opponent chooses to ignore this warning and attacks anyway. So you rise to your feet, raising your sword in a guarding action. You move out of the attacker's way and cut down. Once you are sure that the opponent is dead, you can perform the Chinigui, blood wipe, and the Noto. Just as in the earlier forms, this kata begins at an angle, 45 degrees to the right from your opponent. Just as in Yegak, your first movement should be to look at your opponent. They are standing, so you will need to look up. From here, draw your sword about a third, and turn as you kneel up so that your knee, sword and body are pointing 90 degrees from your opponent, whilst you look directly at him. Wait for the attack, and draw straight up into a standing position, without moving your feet, with your sword at a steep angle above your head. This action provides cover in case you are too slow, and the opponent cuts before you step out of the way. From here, drop the right hip into the ground and twist, dropping the sword behind your head. Next, lift the left leg up while balancing backwards. Drop it, then lift the right leg up. Cut and stamp at the same time. Take note of the timing on the stamp. You can hear a distinctive sound. You should strive for the same timing. The cut is aimed for the head and is a two-handed cut. Watch again as the demonstrator performs the turn and cut. Take note of the fact that he drops his hip and twists. He does not move the foot first. Once you have cut to the head, the opponent will fall to the ground. So, still keeping your eye on him, drop your sword and halfway down, draw the left leg back. You must then place the sword on your leg, with the blade slightly up, and pull it towards you. This is the Chinigui, the blood wipe. Reverse your right hand position on the ska, and with a small push from the tip, turn the blade around and perform the Noto. Once your sword is away, walk back to your spot with Zanshin. Kaishaku, in contrast to a kinagashi, is done quietly, almost peacefully. You are an aid to someone who is committing ritual suicide. You are in front of witnesses in a ceremony that is very important. You are not the centre of attention, so you must do nothing that will draw undue attention to yourself. Draw your sword at a slight angle, then step back ready until the agreed time, whereupon you perform a single-handed cut to the back of the neck. Perform a chinagui and a noto, followed by a silent prayer. There should be no sudden movements, and you should at all times have an air of quiet dignity. The first thing you should remember about this form is the surroundings you are in and why you are there. So when you sit down, do so quietly but respectfully. After calmly seating, begin to raise and draw your sword at a slight angle off to the right. Step back with the right leg and allow yourself a loose grip of the sword so that the tip falls down your back with your arm slightly bent. Pause, then begin the cut with the feeling coming from the hips. The kurutsuke is one-handed, katatewaza. Once the cut is completed, pull the sword back slightly on the neck, then bring it to the right leg to perform the chinagui, similar to a kinagashi. The noto is the same, except that there is no forward push. The sword just falls off your leg. Specific points that should be taken note of when performing this kata are that the draw is slightly angled to the right. This is very important, as you must prevent the recipient from seeing the blade. You also need to make sure that you perform a proper cut. Do not just place the sword on the back of the neck. The prayer at the end of the form needs to be performed either when kneeling down or when stood up, but not both. You must choose one and stick to it. Kaishaku. Again in this form, you face a standing opponent from your kneeling position. After you have looked at your opponent, you begin to rise, offering him a target and causing hesitation. After a brief pause, avoid his attack and cut down on his forehead, making him stumble back. Chase and cut him down, then with awareness, prepare yourself to cut again. Follow your opponent down as he falls. Perform the chinagui, noto, and then finish. The speed of this kata depends on the opponent's movements and your reaction to them. Therefore, the first half of the form should be done in avoidance, and once the second cut is performed, your actions may be less hurried. From the seated position, bring your hands to the sword and your knees together. Rise up and draw slightly forward, exposing your wrists, hands, arms and head, and giving your opponent a target. Pausing briefly, quickly rise to your feet, pulling everything back so that your opponent barely misses you. Quickly counterattack, cutting your opponent on the forehead. As he staggers back, apply pressure with the tip of your sword, and with the feeling of falling forwards, chase the opponent and perform the final cut. Deliberately raise your sword so that your left hand is level with your forehead, in case the opponent is still a threat. The timing of the beginning of this form is very important. There must be a pause after the first cut, giving the opponent time to fall back, and allowing you space to perform the second cut. Take a close look at the timing of the first two cuts. It is important that this is done correctly. Once the opponent is down and you are sure he is no longer a threat, slowly lower the sword, and as the sword comes down, drop to your right knee. Reverse the grip of your right hand and cup the bottom of the tsuba with your left. Rotate the sword, then draw it towards you so that the back of the blade rests across your palm. Keep your elbow up when you perform the chinagui, as this ensures that you don't pull the sword too far. Rest the back of the blade on your left leg, take hold of the saya, and perform the noto without leaning forward.
Tsukikage.
In Tsukikage, you deal with a standing opponent, and you are sat at a 45-degree angle to the left of him. You look up, then draw forward and slightly up, cutting the opponent's wrists in an arc as he begins to cut you. Your body posture should be very low and stable. From here, you step up and finish with a big kuritsuke, ochiburi, and noto. You do not kneel down whilst performing the noto. The timing in this form is very important, because you are going for the opponent's wrists, so you need to time your cut with the beginning of his. This means there must be certain acceleration at the beginning of the form that can be seen. The nukitsuke itself can be thought of as an extension of your arm, so your shoulder, arm, wrist and the sword should all be in a line at 45 degrees from horizontal. Make sure you do not cut too far to the right. You should be stopping the cut just before his right wrist. Once the nukitsuke is performed, step forward so that your left foot is slightly behind your right. Then slide forward with your right foot and perform a big cut to the horizontal. From here, you perform a standing chiburi and noto without kneeling down. Look at the movement for the nukitsuke. As you draw towards your opponent, cut and then step back into the low position to ensure that you do not miss. If you were to step back first, you would pull your sword away from the opponent. It is an arcing cut, meaning that you are cutting the wrists on the way through the arc. The kuritsuke is aimed at the opponent's chest. What happens is that you have caught his wrists, and he is stumbling back, so you move forward and cut through him. It must be a big cut. Once competent with this form, you can add some speed, breathing more life into it.
Tsukikage.
Oikaze is the only standing form from the Imoriru set. There are many ways of interpreting this form. This is one of the more common interpretations. Walking through a field, you see a figure walking towards you. You get a bit closer and realise that you recognise the other person and decide to attack them. Your opponent has not realised who you are yet, so your first couple of steps are slow and quiet, drawing the sword slowly. Your opponent notices your draw, and so turns to run. You speed up to catch him, then perform Nukitsuke across his lower back. You then finish him off with Kuritsuke, then Chibori and Noto, and back to your beginning spot to finish. In the first movement in this form, your hands come to the sword and your centre of gravity drops, ready to move, acknowledging the person in front of you is the opponent. Begin to move forward. This should be split into two sections, the first being 2 steps. These 2 steps are long, while only drawing the sword a small amount, thinking long step, short draw. You should step by putting the outer edge of your foot down before the inner part of your foot, rolling inwards, trying to make as little noise as possible. After the initial 2 steps, take an odd number of steps, 3 to 5, depending on how much space you have, before reaching your target, drawing and cutting. Through this odd number of steps, your steps shorten and the draw gets longer until you cut. The cut must be low and just above the waist, so you must take a big step forward as you cut. After the Nukitsuke, the opponent falls forward and you quickly chase and perform a low Kiritsuke to finish him off. The transition from the Nukitsuke to the Kiritsuke must be done without raising the body too much. When you have performed the Nukitsuke, you are at a particular height. You must try and retain this height throughout the Kiritsuke and through to the Chibori. The secret to achieving this is in the amount of bend in your knees. Always keep them bent to stay at a certain level. When stepping back for the Noto, you will be a little higher, but step back slowly so that your height diminishes in a slope and does not just drop down suddenly. As with Tsukikage, you do not kneel on the Noto.
Oikaze. Nukiuchi.
For this form you face a seated opponent who you do not trust, as you're still wearing your sword. This is with good reason, because he decides to cut you down. It is only because you are faster that you manage to defeat him. In this form, your opponent makes the first move to draw his sword, and you respond to this. The beginning of the form can be treated the same as Mai. Your hands come to the sword and your knees come together. From here you begin to draw and rise. Almost immediately after you begin to rise, draw upwards ready to cut. Once you are up on your knees and toes, lean back slightly to give yourself a little more momentum, with which you perform a big cut forward, splaying your legs as the cut comes down to add more power. From here, perform Yoko Chiburi and then the Noto. In this Noto, your sword is slightly more on the side and to an angle. This is to prevent your saya from hitting the floor. Do not feel that you must do this form really quickly. A steady speed with all the correct movements is better than trying it too fast, where everything is incorrect. The draw is straight up into the cutting position, and you should not lean back too far before the cut, being very careful when splaying the legs on the drop during the Kuritsuke. It must be controlled. Also, on the Chiburi, try to make it smooth and powerful, rather than jerky. Nukiuchi. To end your training, you must perform the ending reiho. These are the same as the starting reiho, but in reverse order, starting with withdrawing the sword from the obi, the to-rei, and then finally the kemizani-rei. This is how you should finish every training session. This concludes the beginner's training video for the Omori-ryu set of Jikiden Iai. The makers of this video hope that you have found it some help in developing your Iai, in your own practice, as well as furthering your knowledge. By discussing the topics in this production, asking questions, and exchanging ideas when training with your contemporaries, the makers hope that this aid will continue to support your Iai development